Welcome to the Scholar Chronicles. I'm Dr. Loh KS, a historian, and in this podcast, I ask scholars to share their stories from the field, from their research. These stories are rarely shared in public, but I think they are worth bringing to the podcast because they shed light on the research we do, the challenges we face, and the relationship between scholarship and society. And I think the podcast helps us to do two things, right? One is to help people understand the research and how we conduct our research. And the second is to, by way of talking about our methodologies and challenges, help us to be better scholars in a little way. With us today is a friend and colleague I've not seen in 15 years. I met him at a oral history conference that I convened 15 years ago, and then never really kept in touch except to publish the papers from the conference. Coincidentally, I ran into him a couple of weeks ago, and here we are. I was always confident that he would appear on the podcast, and so I want to introduce our guest today, Leong Kar Yen. Kar Yen, how are you?
I'm fine. Okay. Energized. Looking forward to this podcast. We're gonna be this YouTube recording we're gonna be having today.
Give the audience a quick introduction about what you do.
Okay. So I am Leong Kar Yen. I'm actually based in Taiwan, right? I graduated years back with a degree in Southeast Asian studies from NUS. And these few years, right, I've been kind of concentrating on the region, but through the lens of, because I have a background in human rights also. And so a lot of the projects I'm working on now, right, has that kind of theme where I combine both South Asian studies and human rights. And so I've been going in and out. I've been moving amongst all these different countries within the region. And yeah, that's what I've been doing for the past few years. I've concentrated, I began in East Timor, my thesis, ended up in Indonesia. I've been working on the Philippines for the past few years, and now, it's only quite recently, I've been back, Malaysia, Singapore.
When you say background in human rights, what do you mean? Do you mean like you worked in a human rights organization?
Well, I've always had this interest because I spent 1 year in the UK working on a degree on human rights, and it was there, right, that I was kind of exposed to sort of kind of a different kind of methodology, and that has kind of always stuck with me. And it was because of that also that I had this inspiration to kind of carry on with my PhD, which was actually a look at the situation in East Timor in reference to its post-independence situation, reconciliation, truth.
Mm-mm. So again, right, when you say working on human rights, what do you mean by that? Do you mean research or do
Oh,
you mean some other work?
oh, sorry. So what I meant to say was, I mean, it's kind of a mix. I hang out a lot with people within this particular field, sphere, human rights activism. But yeah, specifically for myself, human rights research. Yes.
Well, you're a journalist. Is that something correct or not correct?
Oh yeah. I was
Yeah.
a journalist back in Malaysia for like a few years. At that, well, it was we it still is an independent website. It's called Malaysia Kini. It's a news website. So I was there for like 2 years, 2.5 years, and those years they were very formative in how I thought about a lot of the situation in reference to Malaysia, the region, and especially on this issue of human rights. I mean, that was one of the reasons why I decided to embark on this postgraduate degree of mine in the area of human.
So you were writing stories, you were doing research then as well, right? On.
Well, I'm writing a lot of stories. So I had different beats that I had to cover. I was in the parliament one moment, and I'll be in the ports the next, and then I'll be looking at what's going on in the streets, and the protests and whatnot, all the kinds of. I mean, we placed a lot of emphasis on covering the political. So we were pretty political in that sense. I mean, given the fact that we're independent and whatnot. So this gave me a very interesting view of the world around me. because I just come back from my postgraduate degree in the US, and I was trying to figure out what was going on in Malaysia. And so that stint, right, for like 2.5 years, gave me a really in-depth look at all the issues that Malaysia was facing at that time. And that has kind of allowed me to snowball into a lot of these things that I'm working on now. Because what I was able to see, because of what I was able to write, what the free reign I was given in terms of thinking on this issue.
I mean that's really an interesting thread of continuity, right? In terms of your interest, in terms of that transition, right, from journalistic research or speaking to human rights workers, and then you went to academia. Were there things that you kind of retained from the earlier days in terms of methodologies, and what did academia bring, right, in terms of methodology and concepts and framework to your interests?
Right. When I was, I mean, one of the things that, because when I was doing my PhD, I was working with an anthropologist, and my supervisor in the Department of Social Studies, and he really influenced me in terms of anthropological methods.
Who
And
is this?
this is Irving Johnson. Shout out to
Okay.
Irving from the department. And he really influenced me a lot in terms of my own scholarship. But even then, right, I think what he was able to guide me in terms of my methodology is already an extension of something that I learned when I was a journalist. So I mean, as a journalist, right, I remember one of the few times was when there was a protest outside the parliament, right? It just and then there were a lot of it was a group of elderly. I mean, there was an elderly lady also who, after protesting, I believe she just sat down on the side of the road because she felt so tired. So and then I was just looking around, and there was a lot of hoo-ha going all over the place. And then I just sat down and started talking to her. And so it's being a journalist, right, at that point in time allowed me to kind of hone my skills in terms of relating to people. And that's how I think it kind of expanded into my work when I did my PhD. That's what I did. I spent a lot of time talking to people, and I spent a lot of time trying to understand where it is that they were coming from. Because I think one of the ways that it started me thinking, it's like you can talk about human rights theories, right, at one level, but then it's really important to be able to relate to the people in which that situation is affecting, right? So it was transition. It was a move. It wasn't so that huge a transition. So it was, to me, right, being a journalist, being able to see is also an important part of what it means to be in academia, to be able to see. And so when I got to when I got to my PhD work, right, there was a huge emphasis on that, because a lot of the methodologies that we dealt with, a lot of the methodologies that were being taught were very critical theory, postmodern, post-colonial methodology. And that kind of led me to what it is I'm working on now. So when I think when I try to categorize the work that I'm doing, it has to do a lot with issues like liminality, traces, absence. So these are three main words that I usually look for. And I think a lot of for me, right, at least in terms of my role, my obligation as an academic, right, is to investigate these liminal spaces, to understand the traces, and to look at the absences. And so, yeah, it's kind of like a big jump from being a journalist to this part in academia. But I think that's how I kind of develop. Still developing.
Sure. I mean, actually, I do wish that more academics come from more diverse backgrounds, rather than from an academic background right after university, because I think those experiences do shape who they are, and to see that world outside, right, and to continue to maintain that link with the world outside. I think that's very important. I want to talk about, so the three words were liminal, traces, and absences. Is that right?
Well, liminality,
Right.
traces, and absences.
Right. Okay. And I think it's kind of encapsulated in your work over memory, right? So what got me interested in your work was that memory oral history part. The oral history conference that we convened at the time, I was kind of obsessed with this idea of fragments, right? No longer. I'm no longer that obsessed so much. Although I'm still very much, doing oral history these days.
Mhm.
I don't know how I got to invite you. Do you remember?
I think,
Must
no,
have
I
been a
can't.
recommendation from somewhere, right?
I think so. I think so. And then
Mm-mm.
I threw in my abstract, and then you were okay with it, and I was like, the
Yeah.
rest is history. But
Yeah.
I learned a lot from that book too. I learned a lot from the kind of framing that we put ourselves into in relation to that, and especially the terms fragments, because I haven't thought about this word for a long time, and now you mentioned it, right? It's, I mean, if I want to include it in my lexicon of terms, right, in how these terms have contributed to the way I think about my work, I think fragments is a big thing, but it's a big part of it too, because I think that amount of time that I spent with people in the workshop with the ideas was very, very helpful.
Mm-mm.
Liminality was something I picked up when I was in the US, and then fragments, and then traces and absences is what I'm thinking about right now. But then there's something else beyond that. So I haven't really gotten to around to thinking about that yet, but it's somewhere in my head. Well, it is like, I mean, the phrase I often like to use, right? Because liminality, fragments, spaces, absences, traces, absences. I always in terms of my work, I always end up with this one phrase, which is remaking the world. So it's a beautiful phrase that I've applied it. It's a long, long time.
Remaking the world. So that is the social purpose of academic research, don't you think?
I don't know about social research, but for me, it is like it's been
Mm,
something that
mm,
I've been kind of obsessed about for a long time. Because when I think about Southeast Asia, right? I mean, my place now, it's as you know, in relation to our conference a long time ago, it's very fragmented, but it is also characterized by moments of liminality, of which it continues to experience right now. And then it is definitely very much characterized by traces and spaces. So the way I look at my work, right, is how do I bring all these things together, right,
mm.
to show that there is an effort in, despite the spaces, despite the traces and absences and the fragments, of how do people, communities remake the world to that extent.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, definitely, I want to come back to that point later on, right? I mean, one of
Mm-hmm.
the aims of the podcast is to explore this and to encourage this wider relationship between academics and the world that they live in, the research that they do. Um, so, memory, right? How do you? What is your methodology again, right? Like, let's say you are studying the one of your research, right? The massacres in Indonesia in 50s, 65, 66.
Mm-hmm.
So what do you do? Do you go to the field and how do you get to the informants, the participants, the eyewitnesses? What has your experience been in trying to interview these people?
It's yeah, I spent a good 2 to 3 years going back and forth Indonesia and
Mm,
in Taiwan. So over the months during the summer, I spent like months on in Indonesia, and I usually concentrate. I mean, my base is usually Yogyakarta, and I've gone as far as Semarang. So I'm very central Java. Um, I've been to certain areas in East Java. I tend not to go so much to West Java.
mm,
But over those years, right, I was very fortuitous because there was a university, and then there was a center in that university, and they dealt with issues pertaining to human rights and, of course, uh, mass killings in '65, which is a big issue for them. And so from that center, right, there was a I think there was a farmer, a Catholic priest associated with that center. And he was very helpful in providing me all these different kinds of points of entry. And I got to know a lot of these different people, especially people who were directly affected by what happened in that period. Of which over a period of a year or so, scholars have stated that between 500,000 to 1 million people disappeared, killed, put in detention, arbitrarily detained, and whatnot. So from there, right, I kind of was introduced to key people. It was also part of this program that I had with my university, my previous university, where had students interning with this organization. So I used that as an opportunity not to just engage with my own project, but to also to get students to know a little bit more about that. And from there, right, it's very important, right, especially when we're doing this kind of research, to develop contacts, especially amongst people I would often refer to as gatekeepers. So these gatekeepers are key individuals, right, groups that, for whatever reason, they're also kind of interested in the topic. You find that a lot of young people also are interested in this topic because it's a gap. There's a space there in terms of knowing what exactly happened, the details, consequences, the impacts, and whatnot. So from there, right, I had my groups, I had my key person, and it involves two things. It involved speaking to people, that's one, and it involved also trying to understand spaces. So one of the part of my methodology also, right, is aside from hanging out with people, talking to people. Usually when I conduct interviews, they're open interviews, so we can, I'll just open it up to the person I'm speaking to, and then this person will just go on and on. It's sometimes difficult because some of them don't actually speak Indonesian. I speak Indonesian, variant of it. But I don't speak Japanese. So a lot of these people, they speak Japanese. Japanese sometimes feels like a totally different language altogether. In fact, it is. So it's hanging out with people, interviewing people. It's learning more from my gatekeepers, from my community of gatekeepers. And it's also about being able to take into consideration spatiality of this research. Because I find a lot of times these memories, right, are not just embedded in human beings, they're embedded in buildings as well. They are embedded in how people think about these buildings. And sometimes it's not even buildings, it's just empty spaces. So what do people think about the empty spaces? What kind of meaning do they imbibe into these empty spaces? So it was, when I was doing fieldwork, that it was everything. It's a mess. So when you go into the field, when you're not familiar with the place, I mean, I know Indonesian, I'm familiar with Indonesia, but as an object of academic study. But before I went in, right, it's not just an object of academic study. It's a lived experience as well. So I was trying to figure out what was going on, and the culture and all that. It's fascinating, but over a period of time, I also began to kind of understand, right, like I said, the spatiality of things. And so from there, right, it kind of after a few more years moving in and out of Indonesia, it started to kind of sort of make a lot more sense. And I knew what kind of questions to ask, approach, how to use particular kinds of ideas and methodologies and theories to kind of frame this thing called Indonesia, and especially to frame what it is that I'm trying to work on in terms of the mass killings.
Yeah, right. And that's a very nice way to kind of talk about the challenges, right? You talked about it took a long time, right, for you to kind of get a sense of where the memories really lie, and understand the subject. What have been some of the issues in interviewing people in Indonesia?
Well, it has a lot to do with, like I said,
Sorry, let me phrase the question again. Like, give us a couple of stories about people that you've interviewed, and it has been, not, or it didn't unfold the way that you expected it to be.
It never unfolds the way I wanted to. I mean, I never expect anything to fold out any kind of way I wanted to. if it happens, it happens. I guess that's the only way. I guess you'll actually really be able to survive field work is to just just go with the flow. I think one of the things is one of my interviewees, right, was kind of asking us, not scolding me in a sense, but always he would at that point in time he was asking, so you come in and you ask all these questions, right, and then how is that going to make my life better, right? How is that going to improve my condition and my situation right now? Because a lot of these people that I interviewed, right, they even this former political detainees, right, they would be in that state of limbo for many many years, even after being released from like the penal colonies that they were put into. Right, they would come out and they would still have to report to the police over a long period of time, and to that extent, right, the system that was existed at that point in time, right? Immediately after, and then those decades up until the end of the Suharto regime, right? A lot of these former detainees were continued to they were young when they started out, they were incarcerated, and then after that, there was this new political underclass that was created by the state. So you can see on their identity cards, right, the kinds of political detainees they were. And so they had been in that position for a very, very long time. They were stigmatized for decades. So the question that came back to me was that you asked, so how is this going to help me? And this has been an issue that has been, I guess, haunting me for a very long time, right? Because it gets you to think about your role as a researcher when you go in, right? I mean, what are you doing? You're going in, you're taking these stories, you're writing all these things. But then, as academics, we've got certain things that we need to do, certain obligations. So you've got to write your stuff, you've got to publish. Then you're constantly thinking about, how am I going to get tenure, motion, and all that kind of stuff. So a lot of times, right, it's really the work that you do, right, for the most part. I mean, someone has told me cynically once, like, Kar Yen, your stuff, right, is only going to be read by at most 2, 3 people, of which, I don't know, 2, 3 people, 2 of them are reviewers, right? And if someone is nice enough along, they'll, okay, I'll read that article for you, or something like that. Like my friend, right, I forced him to read my stuff all the time. He's like, why are you doing this to me, Kar Yen? But what is the, I mean, in terms of what it is we do, right? I mean, what is the impact and that's and it's not. I don't think so much about that, but I think very much about how what when we it's like when you go into a place, right, you absorb and you write and you do what you do, but how does it then contribute to what the community is trying to do in and of its own? And yeah.
Let me just jump in. What was your reply to that person?
I would just my response was that was when I first started the project. I didn't really know how to respond.
Yeah, sure.
I was like, I was like, I'm I guess on the spot, right? I was also thinking I was also telling him that it's important, right? That it's important that these stories come up. It's important that someone keeps a record of the stories. It's important that someone put these stories on record so that they can be retained to generations. And so that was my kind of not very good way of responding to him.
Sure. I completely understand. I mean, and I think this is one of the cases where the interviewer who is usually in charge, right, is taken aback and unable to reciprocate in terms of insightful or even meaningful response. There is a very good article, right, in the Oral History Reader by Daniel James, who was interviewing a politician, a right-wing politician in, I think, Argentina, was it, in South America, and he kept pushing and pushing because he wanted to know more. He felt that the interviewer had more to give and was just giving him stock answers. So he kept pushing. And one day, the interviewer struck back at him and said, what is it that you want from me? And went on to demand, in terms of what the interviewer, what the academic can give back to that conversation, that how to make it an equal conversation, right? And
Yep.
when you said the question of what's it going to do for me, that is a very real question. That I think whatever your answer is, and I think all interviewers should take note of this, right? Whatever your answer is, you must be prepared to give an answer.
Yep.
All right. Yeah. And I think that must be part of our preparation for an interview. And it could be just as simple as, not much, just to be honest. I think honesty is ultimately what you said, right? You can condense it and give it back to them. That this might not help you materially, but it's part of, the memory of the country. This is what the country needs, what the community needs. And in Singapore, we would say something like, "This is your national service," right? Of course, when it comes to things like massacres and all that, there might not be enough to impose on them that kind of burden, right? I mean, they have had one burden, and now they are going to have to shoulder another one, right? By speaking to you. So I guess the need for an answer is quite real, right? And if we want to talk about the social purpose of our research, then one of it must be to be able to answer these questions well, right?
That's true. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
But not just answer the question, but to also constantly engage with yourself in thinking about this issue as well. So it's not just the question never changes. The contexts are different, and so all these things also, it reoccurs in different contexts. So in Indonesia, it was an issue for me. Then in the Philippines, and now currently the work that I'm doing.
Yeah. I mean, the other thing I want to ask you about the interviews, right, is when it comes to traumatic events like this, that makes a lot of people try to deal with the pain, right, and the memory of the things that happened, whether it's a massacre or political detention. And there has been some work in the oral history literature. So, for example, one of the things that the interviewees tend to do, like in Stalinist Russia, is they would create their own stories because there is a gap, and they cannot remember, or it's too painful to remember. So they create their own stories, or they borrow someone's stories into the story. So it is not their real memory, or it could be the state narrative, right? They could absorb the state narrative and put it into it. So all kinds of questions of reliability, but not just reliability, right? It shows how people are struggling to cope with trauma. Have you encountered such examples when you are doing the interviews?
As in how people deal with trauma?
Like when the stories they tell seem a bit dubious.
I wouldn't call it dubious. I mean, one of the points that I make in my articles is that one of the more interesting stories that occurred was when me and my friend we were out looking for it, and I love those times. It was sitting on the back of the motorcycle, and we'd be going in and out of all these areas in Semarang and Jogja, right? It would be just for Semarang. He'll take me on the countryside. You'll be able to see the length and breadth of and all these rubber plantations and whatnot, which is where we were trying to look for these mass graves, because these were great places for people to. Sorry, I shouldn't say that. These were ideal places for whoever it is that were doing the killing back then, right? The authorities, paramilitary groups, whatever. These were ideal places for them to execute people, to just bury them in mass graves out in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of some rubber plantation, palm oil plantation. But we chanced upon this gentleman, right, who began to tell us all these fantastic stories about how this is he's a jurubunchi, also a gatekeeper in that sense, in that he would be taking care of that space, and then you will see the space having all these objects in it that people use for, for worship. So candles and small little containers of flowers and all that. So that was an indication to us, right, that something had happened there. So we chanced upon this gatekeeper, and he was telling us about how this is a great place for this is the place where people would come and then they would, get numbers there. And they would, and then the lottery numbers that were based on lottery numbers in Singapore. And they would ask for numbers in this particular spot, right? Because the spirit in this place is especially strong. And he would be the one to he acted this old person, this older man was the intermediary between those people requesting for numbers and the spirit that supposedly would give them really good numbers. But after a while, we figured out that he was also a former political detainee himself. And he was telling us about how this place is especially potent, right? Because there was a woman there who was associated with the idea of the Communist Party. She was supposedly a member of the Communist Party in Indonesia at the time. And she was very strong, she was powerful, she was very literate and all that. And she died with her child and something like that. And this was a way for him to talk about her. And this was also a way for him to talk about his own experiences, having been a detainee, having been a member of the PKI. And so sometimes it's the way I think about it is that a lot of the stories are not so much dubious, but really fantastical. And it's fantastical, right? Because I mean, if you look at what went on back then, right? I mean, the event was also really fantastical. It was phenomenal. It was momentous, right? But I mean, in a sense, right? I guess for a lot of these former political detainees, because there is a limit as to how much it is that they can speak about their own experiences, given the fact that they've been so institutionalized, right? All those years where they've been stigmatized and all that, that this is one particular way of talking about it. So you don't have to necessarily say directly that this is what happened, but there are many different ways. And so I spent a lot of time looking into and trying to understand the rites and the rituals that comes along with grave visitations in Indonesia. It was an eye opener for me because I never thought that, oh my gosh, I have to then actually put more time and attention into looking at Javanese rituals, Javanese culture, right? But that was that was a core part of his belief. That was a core part of practices that were being.
I find this discussion quite interesting because I mean, for you, the memory is fantastical and it shows the overlap, but as well as the difference, right, between memory studies and oral history, right? So in my case, usually the primary motive for me is to, help me to write my history. And usually this social history, so the interviewee is someone I'm drawing upon for stuff, right, for the content of history. Whereas for you, the fact that memory is very diverse, very complex, is interesting in itself, right? It's not a problem, and it could be for me, right? I mean, I can talk about memory, and I've talked about like the memories of the difficulty of remembering, right, in the Singapore context. But I usually prefer to write about history rather than talk about memory. So I guess that's a nice kind of overlap there, right? Tension, right, between the memory studies and oral history. And I think many of the oral historians are often deemed to be less sophisticated intellectually compared to the memory studies people because they have theory behind them. But I think we are all thinking about the same issues, lah. Which is how do people remember the past and what is the relationship between past and present, right?
Because the past sometimes is very difficult to talk about, especially in this region.
Yeah.
It's because there are so many instances where, for whatever reasons, right, especially in Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, there are so many, and going back to our conference, right, things are fragmented. And things are fragmented because there's no space for you to talk about it. But what if there's a different way in which people what if there are different tools that people rely on in order to be able to still try to talk about these things, whether in the form of fantastical stories, ghosts,
Mm.
rumors and all that. Because if you think about ghosts, spirits and all, and these are very liminal meanings, they're in between. But there are also very representative and symbolic kind of histories that we have in this region, in that, we something has happened, but we haven't really been able to totally deal with that. And it still exists in some form, in a spectral way, and it inhabits people's memories, but then people can't really put a finger on it because it's there and it's not there. So how then do people talk about it, right? So some
Mm.
of the things that a lot of the works that I've been kind of influenced by also is like Peonic Form's writings on Vietnam. Where it talks about the immediately in the late 80s, the early 90s, more and more, Vietnam is beginning to reopen its economy and all that. But the people of Vietnam still have to figure out. So what exactly happened in Vietnam War? How do we deal with those issues? And it was at that point in time this kind of tension in his book. It was beautifully written, right? This tension between modernity and the past. So as the country is trying to move into economic modernity, whatever, right? These things that were not able to deal with in terms of the war trauma and all that. So it's the same thing. I'm also very influenced by the stuff that I've been reading on in terms of Cambodia. That the same tension continues, and then of course, without a doubt, right? Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore, tensions every other day.
Mm.
So how do we write those parts out, right? How do we talk about? How do we how do we make these things visible? So it's not that, to me, the way I look at it, it's I cannot totally write out the whole truth and nothing but the truth. But
Mm.
I'm interested in that kind of way that people try to understand this kind of liminality, this moving back and forth. That to me is really fascinating. That's why memory studies is a very helpful way of thinking about this.
Mm. Yeah. I want to ask you a bit about spaces, right? I've not really thought about the spaces. So, what are the big problems in terms of trying to study these spaces and, bring them into the research? Like, is there a threat of redevelopment, these spaces being lost? I mean, that's a real problem in Singapore, but maybe not so much in other places in Southeast Asia, or how to interpret these spaces, or
Actually, there's this place called Glodok, right in the heart of Jakarta, where after the 1998 riots, during that time that when that article was written, right, this is like maybe 5, 6, 7 years after the events, there was a major riot, and it was part of this kind of repertoire of all this violence that occurred when Suharto was being forced down, whatnot. So this area of Jakarta, right, it's like Chinatown, like you have a lot of ethnic Chinese people there. So the shops and all that were targeted. So when that happened, right, they and following the events of the riots back then, right, 1998, May, if I'm not mistaken, they left it like that. They didn't want to do anything with it because I think the logic was, if I were to fix this place up, it's just gonna people are just gonna burn it down again. So when I went there in 2016 or 17 with my students, it's the neighborhood was still like that.
mm,
So it was then that I began to I developed this, or rather I started reading on this other body of literature where they refer to it as it's hauntological, it's hauntology. So these buildings, right, they're haunting. So like a lot of other buildings I saw in Indonesia as well. Like for instance, this one particular building in the middle of Yogyakarta. They call it they call it Titik Nol. It's right in the middle of the city. And so what happens is, right, that the building is empty, but it's in a bustling neighborhood. So my question was, why is this building, which is right in the middle of this prime area here, why is everything all around it bustling except for the building itself? So I started asking questions. Supposedly, this building had been used and reused again. It was like a library in which all its contents were brought out and burned to the ground and all that. And then later on, it became a place where people were being tortured, especially women detainees.
Mm.
So the stories I hear from the people around me, night, you hear the cries and the screams of women in there and all that kind of stuff. So the building itself stuck out like a sore thumb, right? So the spatiality, the space is there. The space is surrounded by light, but itself looks like, especially when you go at night, right? It looks really odd because the place is kind of falling apart. The building is there, the structure is still there, but it looks like it's falling apart. And it's kind of locked, but people are not allowed to go in. And then there's a warung outside, the little store outside selling coffee, and then they talk about the building and the lady who owns the store. So it's the kind of tales, it's kind of stories, the way they talk that gives it that kind of character. So that building for me, right, was a way to kind of enter into this particular way of looking at this issue. This whole thing about using ontological methods of thinking about things. And then contrasted, right, with all the trips that I made with my friend out into the countryside. I mean, there's nothing, there's no indication that anything had ever happened except for this big expansive space, and then suddenly you see these offerings. And then I remember once, quite a while ago in Semarang, we traveled out to this one place, right? And then there were all these pylon tables just going from one end to the other. And right in the middle of it was this one tree, or this collection of small trees that provided shade to these tombstones that families would visit over and over again during Ramadan, Eid, or just any other, whenever it is that they felt like they wanted to visit, they would go there and you'd see. And you could see, right, that there's these markers that have the year on 65. And then my friend, so this is space, abandoned space, and then there's empty space, and then there's me, and I finished this other paper. Like, it's on the materiality of it. So you can see, right, my the way I work, right, the logic is I start from ghosts to space or abandoned spaces, ghosts to empty space to what my friend was trying to do. Because I remember I was traveling in a car with him, his wife, and our driver, four of us, with a tombstone at the back of the car. Big tombstone. And he carried me, we drove for a few hours, right? Because he wanted to use the tombstone, he wanted to put it in this particular spot in this graveyard to say that this tombstone is in the memory of the people who died and were then buried in this spot. So it's also me, right? The way I try to arrange how I think about the world and my work is that I am trying to explain, right, how people think about empty spaces, and then at the end, right, put that conscious effort into making a space to be able to remember the event. So it's very it's a very dynamic way of looking at things, and it gives me a lot of reasons and excuses to write about a lot of these really fascinating
So
because
just to
there's
clarify, right? Your friend, what was his position? I mean, why was he
he
doing that?
actually he's a lawyer,
Uh-huh.
and but he at the same time he grew up. I think he's around my age because he and I grew up in the Reformasi era, right? So for him, right, it was also that point in time when he was moving in, and he's also he grew up in that he was kind of like a student activist himself, and at that point in time they also began to question the state's narrative, and that I think has stuck with him for a very very long time because
Okay, your friend
he
is
hangs
an
out.
Indonesian or a Malaysian?
He's an Indonesian. He's an
Indonesia, a
Indonesian.
local lah.
So talking about Indonesia,
Okay,
he's
right.
local and
Okay.
Mm.
And he wants to do something, right? Let's put it that way, right?
His friends, they've been in a sense like, I mean, his day job is because he's a lawyer, but then he and his friends also were involved in trying to create this one particular memorial in another spot, right? Where supposedly there were at least, I don't know, maybe 10 people who were buried in that spot, supposedly, according to local law, according to local knowledge. So we made that. He tried to he created a memorial for that, right? And then he's trying to create another memorial for the place when we were traveling in that car with that tombstone in the back of the car.
It's good to have a friend like this. But I guess you can't have friends like this all the time, right?
No, you don't need to have too many of these kinds of friends.
Yeah,
One or
yeah,
two enough already.
yeah, yeah,
It's like,
yeah.
and it just
And
to
this was not planned, right? This was not scripted, right? Like you thought, okay, I'm going to try to encourage someone or find someone to memorialize the place, right? No, this was something that just
no,
happened, right?
it just happened.
Mm.
And then I was told by my contact in Jogja, in Jakarta, that hey, look, why don't you go and look at this guy, Mas Adi? And then he's like, oh, okay. Then I just spoke with him. I told him what I was about, what my research was on. He looked at me, and then he was like, okay. And then after a couple of days, like, hey, are you interested to go here? I'm like, oh, sure. And then we just got on the bike. I remember that trip from the center of the city to that place which is far out. It was like, oh my God, what a ride! But it's interesting, right? And then
Yeah.
he's also, and then he was telling me, oh, you can speak to this person, that person, and then I just spent like the whole day just hanging out with these people in the village and talking to them about their experiences and whatnot. And yeah, it's good because it's also, I think to that extent it's not that difficult to find people, or at
Mm.
least younger people, or even people my age, right, who want to know what's going on, right? Who are trying to fill up that gap. And so, and I mean, there's I had a chapter in this one book on memory activism as well, and he is clearly what we would refer to as a memory activist.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point, right? Because although it was something that just happened, right? But at the same time, you were open-minded about it. You had thought, when someone suggested you talk to this person, you say yes. You didn't think like, okay, I just want to do my research. I just want to interview people, go to the sites. But you were willing to have collaborators, right? In a sense, and that
You,
is
yeah,
very
you,
important.
yeah, you cannot survive without collaborators. One,
Mm,
I mean,
mm,
I usually work on what I call the inshallah principle. This is, the will of God. So everything, anybody asks you anything, anytime, just say yes, lah. I mean, of course, there are certain situations where you shouldn't say yes to lah all the time. But for the most part, doing field work, right? It's a good way to kind of navigate.
And that's a good way for me to kind of go back to that original question by your interviewee, which is how is this going to benefit me, right? So in the case of with your friend, with a memorial, what do you think in terms of trying to make your research a bit more impactful, right? In that sense,
Mm.
what is it that academics who do similar kind of research, which is about the past and memories of traumatic pasts, ghosts, besides writing articles, right? What can be done, you think?
To actively engage, to actively continue to engage with what it is that we have done, right? So it's to me, I think this is something I cannot let go of, even if I want to, because at some point in time, right, all the things that I've learned, all the things that I've done in Indonesia is going to come back to me in one way or another, because all the themes, right, if we continue to talk about spaces and absences, all the themes are intertwined. So in that sense, right, I continue to be academically engaged. But I think also, just in terms of me going with him to memorialize a place, right, is in itself, I guess, a way for me to engage in the situation also. I mean, yes, I'm writing about it, I'm reporting about it, I'm gonna get a journal article out on it as well. But I am also in the midst of it as I'm participating with him, helping out to create that
Mm.
space for this specific memory in that place as well. So in a way, right, I think even as we are going in there to do whatever academic work we do, there shouldn't be that kind of division, because a lot of times we really get involved in it, right? We even if we're doing research, right, looking at how people are protesting, we are also involved in it. somehow.
Mm.
Yeah,
Mm.
that's how I think about it too. Even in terms of my own work in the Philippines now, I think to that extent I'm also kind of sort of involved in bringing stories to fore. I mean, having opportunities to for instance, to be able to speak on issues like this in accounts like this, presentations, public seminars, whatever. I think that's also something that we should
Mm.
think a lot about in terms of what we observe.
Yeah, I mean the gatekeepers, the organizations that you go through, uh, are they interested to find out, having helped you, what did you find, and are they interested in your research?
Yeah,
Mm.
definitely. My
Mm.
friend is always asking me, say, "How is it going? How's the article coming along?" That kind of stuff. And then and then of course I think it's also beholden on us to whatever it is that we've written or completed at that point in time. It's good to be able to send it back to them. It's good to be able to keep up with them and say that, hey, how's everything going? It's good to be able to go back and meet up with them. Whatnot.
Yeah, and
Yeah, because
yeah.
it's I mean the gatekeepers that you the friends that you make, right? They're part of this circle, and I think from that also, right? It can I mean this being able to collaborate with them, hanging out with them. Also, you also to a certain extent you extend what it is that you're trying to do as well. And there's I mean the more you hang out with people, right, there are all these other kinds of issues and opportunities that we can continue to work on as
Mm.
well.
Yeah, as a way to do the final question, the final part of the podcast, you
Mm.
name basically half the countries in ASEAN, I think, as your research sites. So that's basically, I think, island Southeast Asia. Um, and
Mm, yes.
how do you, when is it that you decide, I want to go to Philippines, for example, I want to go to Singapore. Um, what is it that triggers that decision, and having gotten there to a new site, how do you adapt to it? How do you give it the respect that it deserves as a country different from your previous country of engagement? How do you do that?
How do I, okay, so to put it simply, how do I readjust myself? Is it something like that?
Yeah, how do you adapt? Yeah.
Uh,
Mm.
I, it, the stuff I work on always, I mean, that there's a theme that binds everything that I do together. So regardless of whether I'm in the Philippines or Indonesia or Malaysia or Singapore, right, there's always going to be something that I can think about at least in terms of human rights. So there's it's so the human rights is a universal theme, and wherever you go, right, and like I was saying just now, right, especially in Southeast Asia, right, there are so many. I mean, there are so many fragments. There are so many things. There's so many absences. There's so many traces of all these issues throughout all these different countries that, to a certain extent, right, even if they're different culturally, linguistically, there are some universal issues that binds all of them together.
Mm.
So that's what I think about when I go. But the experiences in Indonesia, right, and in East Timor as well, when I was there for like half a year, right, has also taught me to be able to kind of just you know be open about adapting
Mm.
to all these different situations. And the good
Mm.
thing about working in island Southeast Asia, maritime Southeast Asia, is because of the fact that there are some that I mean the language that I'm familiar with, Malay, Indonesian, right? I mean, there are linguistic characteristics that are shared amongst all these different countries. It's a to kind of tell people, hey, I'm Southeast Asian, so they use all these words in Malay or in Tagalog or whatever, and so people kind of open up to you in that sense. But the struggles that a lot of these different marginal communities go through are very real, and in a sense, whilst different, very similar. Because I saw traces of what was going on in Indonesia, right, in the Philippines as well. And then I see a lot of what is going on in the Philippines, in Singapore and Malaysia as well. so in that sense, right? It's as they say in Thailand, same but different.
Mm. I think that's a nice way to put it. If there are junior scholars going to the field to look at memory studies from a very practical point of view, right? What kind of advice would you give them?
That's very
Mm-hmm.
important. It's I mean I yeah like, I guess going and this is in relation to your previous
Yeah.
question also. When you like it's a bit of a challenge for me. I mean, operating in Malaysia and Singapore, it comes pretty naturally.
Mm.
Indonesia, or well, I mean, after all those years, but now being in Philippines is a little bit difficult because I'm still trying to learn, I'm still struggling with the with Filipino. So that's a big thing. So sometimes, right, you can I mean you can operate you can basically operate with English, but there's certain things that when they amongst themselves when they speak the dialogue and all that, right? It's when they speak Filipino, and if you don't understand Filipino, you really can't kind
Sure.
of follow up with them. So language is a big thing. Um, but for the most part, right, I think that also has to do a lot with your own attitude. So if you're open to the situation, right? If you are able to you just you express a certain level of humility that you're there to learn, not so much to extract, that you want to be able to understand as much as possible, right? I think people can see that in you. So the idea is, and this is another thing I learned about when I was in East Timor, is don't go in with a preconceived notion. Don't go in with the proposal mindset where, okay, that's what my proposal said. This is what I wrote in the proposal. And I have to go in and I have to do things the way my proposal tells me to do things.
Mm.
That's not going to work because when I step down from that plane, as I touch the East Timorese soil, like my proposal just disappeared. I mean, certain aspects of it is still there,
No,
but
that just tells you how bad your proposal was
yes,
initially.
yes, I wrote. No, it wasn't that bad. It was okay,
I'm just
but
joking,
it's
just
just
joking.
it's
But I mean, you're right. You know that the proposal comes out in an office, right? Reading literature, and then we go
you
to the
have
real world.
that's right. You have
Mm.
preconceived, sometimes even romanticized versions, right?
Yeah,
Because I
yeah.
was working on the issue of truth and reconciliation and all that. I was like, oh, we have this commission, everything's going to be perfect in East Timor now. But when I went in, right, it was anything but perfect at that point in time.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's just a lot of times, and then come back here to my recent work on the Philippines, right? A lot of the situation sometimes can get it's pretty messy.
Yeah, yeah. Without asking you to give your game away, what are some of the unexplored, right, or potentially, interesting sites and spaces and memory spaces that could be deserving of research for younger scholars?
I think there's a lot of work now that's being done on museums.
Mm,
Uh,
mm.
I have an idea of looking at a particular museum in the Philippines, but
Sorry, what museum?
it's like it's more like a space like I mean it's associated with a commission in the Philippines that has to do with trying to remember what happened during the Marcos era from 1972 until 1986, the martial law era.
Mm.
So I was very taken by the objects that they had. So the museums, of course, is a great way to start. But I mean, of course, they're curated or whatnot, but it's a great way to start. And then the other thing that I'm also thinking about right now, right, is kind of sort of a project I'm working on, is how um and this is in relation to I work on a lot of things. So as you can see, when I speak, right, all over the place, I get confused sometimes. I'm talking about I'm looking at the ways in which because right now my current project is on the death penalty. I'm looking at how different abolitionist groups portray the lives of those who are on death row through all these different exhibits. And I'm also very interested right now in the idea of visuality, the power of photographs, the power of representation, and how, especially family members, right, talk about their loved ones who have been executed through these photographs, right? Because how do they relate to it? How do they look at it? How do they not look at it? If they don't look at it, like, what do they look at now? What things do they rely on in terms of remembering the people who have been executed? So museums, very important, but photographs, visuality, the relationship between that person and the object also is something really important to take into consideration. So a couple of things, right? So it's not just stories, it's space, and it's also objects.
Thanks a lot, Kar Yen. Really learn a lot from you.
Thank you.
And your dedication to investigate all these spaces in memory, difficult memories, and giving voice to people who have suffered, who have been at the edges of society in the past as well as the present. So it's been a great pleasure speaking to you.
Thank you very much for having me today.
We should catch up when you're next in Singapore, and I think you will be in Singapore, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it shouldn't be 15 more years later.
No, definitely not.
So keep in touch, Kar Yen. I'll let you know when the episode drops.
Okay, great. Will do. Thanks a lot, Nasing.
Thanks a lot. Bye.
Okay, take care. Bye.